Welcome to this IUN Community Garden session, The Gem of Chicago Wilderness. The presenter for today's session is Dr. Spencer Courtwright. Dr. Courtwright is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at IU Northwest. He is well regarded as an expert in the local ecology of Northwest Indiana and has been training students and engaging the public around the science of restoration throughout the region for many years. On most days, you will find him working in the Little Calumet River Prairie and Wetlands Nature Preserve, which is adjacent to the IUN campus, an important site in the ecological restoration of this largely urbanized region. Welcome, Dr. Courtwright. Glad to have you here.
Well, thanks, Amanda and Leslie, for having me come present today. And thanks for everyone for coming to attend or who's watching and listening in the future. And CURE, the Center for Urban and Regional Excellence, kind of gives us a hint about what we're doing. I think most people believe that Northwest Indiana is ecologically of interest, but I think most people think it primarily because of the dunes. And while the dunes are great, it turns out the entire Chicago area is an amazing ecological natural area, even though 9.5 million people call our area home. So the full title of our presentation today is The Gem of Chicago Wilderness, Ecology and Restoration of the Greatest, or a Great, Ecological Region of the U.S. Now that's kind of a phantasmagoric title, and you may be thinking, I've been places that seem better than our area, but we're going to work through this, and I think we'll have you convinced before long that we have an amazing ecological area. So our goals are fourfold. One is to quantify our ecological gem, and then to convey how we became the big kahuna in terms of ecology, at least in the 48 states of the United States. Second will be to illustrate several examples of our ecological gem. Some of those will be in the dunes region. Third will be to emphasize the restoration needs of our ecological gem. We won't be able to retain first place if we don't do a lot more restoration than we are of our nature preserves. And fourth goal is to get everyone excited about going out and doing restoration, or at least getting out more often and experiencing our ecological area. Well, a little bit of background about me and how I came to the point where I give a presentation like this. For many years, my entire focus was animal ecology, in particular amphibian ecology. And I did over a quarter of a century of work on amphibians. One of my favorites is the spotted salamander. You may be familiar to a degree with one of its breeding habitats, Deep River Water Park, not the water park per se, but just a few hundred yards into the woods to the south. They breed in that habitat. They lay their egg masses like this. They suffer predation from bigger salamanders. So here's a hatchling spotted salamander predation. I studied all these interactions in my kind of test tube rack, which is these cages in a wetland. Did that for over a quarter of a century. And during that time, for the most part, I thought if a nature preserve was green, it was good. But when I came here to IU Northwest in the fall of 1992, I learned from some local botanists that not all green is good, and that a lot of our botanical realm here is filled with plants from Europe, Eurasia, or East Asia. And they badly degrade our system. So I decided I would start learning the native plants, and I got better over the years. And now I've been doing about a quarter of a century of work on restoration ecology. And if you do that arithmetic, you might think, well, this guy's pretty old, but there was a lot of overlap in the time of that 27 and the 25 years. So let's get into the meat of our presentation today. What is Chicago wilderness? It's a kind of an amoeba-shaped entity here from extreme southeast Wisconsin through northeast Illinois, northwest Indiana, and including a small part of Michigan. Within this area is defined mostly by drainage. Most of the water leaves as part of the Illinois River right down here. So most of the rain that falls in here is in this watershed coming out here. A little bit goes over toward Rockford, a little bit goes into Lake Michigan, but most of it is an ecological watershed, so to speak. The dark green are all areas that are presently in nature preserve, like this one here in the Palos area. I think it's around 20,000 acres. The Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie, the Indiana Dunes over here, and so on. The lighter green are areas that could be restored. They either flood a lot, like down here along the Kankakee River, otherwise are in forested habitat, like on the Valparaiso Moraine or in McHenry and Lake County. Those could be, through restoration and cooperation, could become nature preserves. The lighter color is mostly agriculture. The dark tan is already built up as homes, factories, malls, and all that. There are about 545,000 acres in Chicago Wilderness, and there's always something exciting happening in Chicago Wilderness, even in the wintertime. For example, if you go to Kankakee Sands, which is about 8,000 acres right here, you can see northern harriers, a type of hawk, just flying low to the ground over their prairie preserve. You can see short-eared owls, which are, to my knowledge, the only hawks or owls that hover like a helicopter. So if you see a large bird hovering over the prairie, that's it. Rough-legged hawk there. And 2 years ago, the white-faced ibis was seen at Kankakee Sands, and I'd never heard of a white-faced ibis. It looked like something from the Caribbean. It sounds like it. But it turns out it actually uses wetlands in western Nebraska. Some got a little bit wayward and found Kankakee Sands super exciting. So there's always fun stuff going on in Chicago Wilderness. So let's quantify our ecological gem. How do you quantify the ecological quality of an area or a region? The most important factor is the number of plant species and the annual production, how much biomass is made of those plant species. And the big reason for that is the greater the variety of plants, the greater the variety of animals that can be supported in the system. And then also, if you have good production of plants, then you'll have more for the rest of the food web to consume. So how does Chicago Wilderness compare to, say, the National Park System? It turns out that Mike McDonald at this web link here has tabulated that there are 1,867 species in the Chicago, native plant species in the Chicago Wilderness area. What's the best national park? I thought it would be Great Smoky Mountains or something like that, but it turned out to be Grand Canyon National Park at 1,554 native vascular plant species, and so-so production because they have a lot more dry parts of the year. So we beat them by over 300 plant species. Chicago Wilderness is 545,000 acres of preserved. Grand Canyon is 2 million acres of preserved land. So we beat them by 300 species, even though we have much less land in nature preserved. Now, some people might argue that some of these plant species are likely extinct in the Chicago area because of the 9.5 million people and all that we do. Even if we took 300 out of this list, we still beat the best in the national park system. And this is true throughout Chicago Wilderness, this great plant diversity. For example, Leidig Bog, owned by Shirley Hines Land Trust, just between Michigan City and South Bend, is fewer than 200 acres, but has about 530 native plant species in it. I dare you to check with any of your relatives from California to the Maine and ask them about a nature preserve that has over 200 acres that has over 500 plant species. I bet you they won't be able to come up with one. And there are lots of preserves. Creek Ridge County Park in LaPorte County has about 430 plant species in fewer than 100 acres. This is just repeated many, many times over in Chicago Wilderness. Now, if you haven't learned much about native plants, nowadays is the best time. It's the golden age. We just had recent books come out, The Wildflowers of the Indiana Dunes and wildflowers of the Midwest. And these can get you going on a few hundred of those 1,800 species. And if that reading gets you infected to learn more about the environment, I put down 5 books that I think are the top 5. And the one that's hot nowadays is Nature's Best Hope, about native plants and what every person in the US can do to help nature out. This is a must read for everyone, by Doug Tallamy. And while you're at it, just kill it whenever you're killing time on YouTube. Just put in Doug Tallamy and watch his webinars, and you'll just be blown away. He has several different kinds of webinars. But Aldo Leopold in the 1930s and 40s wrote a Sand County Almanac about a county in Wisconsin. That's great. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that ended up getting DDT banned. Biodiversity by Edward O. Wilson and Half Earth are 2 other great books to read. Well, how did we get to be the gold medal in terms of native plant diversity in the US? And it's all about location. We're at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, as we know, and we get weather that comes up from the south, hot and humid in July, thunderstorms, but it happens all time of the year. We get moist, warm weather from the south. So many plants that like the climate of the southern Mississippi region and the Carolinas, they find our area fine. We also get weather masses that come from the west, which tend to be warm and a bit drier. And we find that species that like the Great Plains out here in Nebraska and western Iowa find our area good. We also get those cold air masses. We notice them most in January, but we also get them at any time of the year. So plants that thrive in the upper Great Lakes region also are found here. Also about location is Lake Michigan, because it kind of tempers all these different climatic patterns that we have. And then finally about location, we were under ice at the maximal extent of the last glaciation. Half a mile to almost a mile of ice was over us. We're used to seeing pictures of mountain glaciers, but these were continental glaciers, sheets of ice like this. If Willis Tower was here, it would just look like a little toothpick. So these glaciers, as they moved down, could just obliterate the landscape. But as they melted back, they released all kinds of variable soil and rock materials, sometimes a gravelly soil, sometimes a silty outwash, sometimes a sandy outwash. Because of how the glaciers melted over our area, we get a spectacular potpourri of soil types. And here we see a map just showing some of the most grand level of soil variation in the Chicago wilderness area. And let's take a quick field trip here to a spot in Countryside, Illinois, which is over here, just along I-55 a little bit. Just north of I-55. And on this map, it shows that there's just one kind of soil there. But here's the actual nature preserve I'm talking about. There's more across the street. This is I-55 294 LaGrange Road. And Theodore Stone Preserve, in this eastern part, it has the bedrock is more or less at the surface of the soil. So it's a really rocky, gravelly soil. And you get this kind of open prairie look there. But then, like the Great Wall of China, the soil changes and the bedrock dips down under, and you get a deeper, richer soil. So the prairie looks more like this in the western part, and then looping all around it, I don't have a picture of that, you have woodland and oak savanna soils there, all jammed into a small nature preserve. And again, this is replayed all through Chicago wilderness. On the theme of plants from other areas liking our area, this savanna plant loves the heat of Louisiana, East Texas, Arkansas, and southern Missouri, but finds okay up here. This prairie grass has Iowa as its main part of its range, but does all right here. This wetland rush likes wetlands along the coastal plain, but also finds our area good. This beautiful wild senna has kind of a key range along the Appalachians, but on the western edge, we're here. And then we have cow wheat, which loves it up north and New England and Canada, upper Great Lakes, they're found here. This wetland sedge, again, same thing, common in the northern Great Lakes area, fine here. And then finally, a couple of trees. The jack pine loves the north, finds our area okay. And then birch, paper birch, loves the north, but finds our area still okay. We could do this all night with hundreds and hundreds of species, but we're the crossroads of America, as the motto of Indiana says, but it's true for botany. And these habitats are just all smashed together. Here's a map showing northern Porter, northern Lake, northern Porter, and northwest LaPorte County, and yellow is prairie, the green is some kind of woodland, aquatic habitat, sand habitat. It's a crazy quilt of habitats, and we can see it in this old historic rendering. It goes even south of those areas into northern Newton, northern Jasper, and Stark counties. Gets to be a little more prairie here. Go to Kane County, Illinois, and you're constantly going in and out of wooded areas, or into southeast Michigan, Racine County. Same thing, you're moving through all kinds of habitats. Now let's look at McHenry County. So here's Cook County right here, McHenry's up here. And this map shows where the wooded areas, the oaks of McHenry County. And so the darker the tan, the more of an oak woodland it is, that as you move toward the white, the woods open up to savanna. We'll talk more about the definition of this, and into the prairie. These face east, these face south. They're much hotter. Going this gradient faces north. That's cooler facing, and every possible combination of moving into and out of woodland areas. It makes for incredible diversity of plants and animals. Excuse me. And then here are the two Wisconsin, or the few Wisconsin counties that are in Chicago wilderness. And anytime you think of the natural habitats, you have to think of the Native Americans. All these little dots in southeast Wisconsin here are Native American encampments, and they influence the vegetation, as we'll see. So we had a lot of oak woodland and savanna in the north part, more prairie, but a mix of everything in the central part, and then prairie, oak, savanna, dunes, forest, every possible combination in northwest Indiana, and different kinds of maps there. Now, on that theme of being the greatest, some people may say that just adding up the number of species doesn't really give the accurate picture. So what we could do is the number of native plant species per 10,000 square kilometers. So this gives us a more of a standard measurement. So the browns and yellows are not very diverse. The darker greens and blues are very diverse. So we can see that Chicago wilderness is in a darker green area. Now, we kind of get shortchanged here a little bit because half our area is out in Lake Michigan. So there can't be any vascular plants there. So that kind of hurts us. But we do see some hot spots over here southeast of Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And this peninsula down here is a hot spot. North of Tallahassee, Florida is another hot spot, part of southern Arizona, the area north of Los Angeles and the Sierra. But we're just below the blue area in density of plant species. So we're still great using this measurement. Now, how to find these nature preserves? You might have your favorite one nearby that you like to go to. I estimate there are at least 400 nature preserves in the Chicago wilderness area, probably more. But land trusts over the last 40 years have done heroic work in making nature preserves available to people. In Northwest Indiana, Shirley Hines Land Trust. In McHenry County, the Land Conservancy of McHenry County. I cheat a little bit. Acres Land Trust is actually just east of Chicago wilderness, but they're a globally great land trust. So do some staycations where you go a little further away. Niches Land Trust, same thing, but south of Chicago wilderness. Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, Indiana Division of Nature Preserves. There's a similar site in Illinois. Every county parks forest preserve system in Chicago wilderness is world-class compared to most areas. Let's just take a quick look at McHenry County here. They have a very interactive web page, but you can find all their preserves just with a couple of clicks, and we can see in McHenry County, there are a few dozen nature preserves, and we can scroll down and we can see 283 acres, 608, 1,600. There's almost too many acres in preserve. They have trouble managing them all, as you'll see in a moment. 800 acres, 345, 300, 3,400, and so on. A lot of acres in those preserves. Kane has an amazing number of preserve forests. Preserve District of Cook County, world class. Will County, southwest of Cook County, is a great collection of nature preserves, and so on. State parks, Indiana Dunes National Parks, and you can learn a lot about habitats by going to this site at Michigan State University. But last month, we took a staycation to McHenry County for Memorial Day weekend. So we just picked a few preserves at random. We went to the FelPro RRR Nature Preserve. FelPro is an automotive company. They used to own the site, and I think RRR stands for rest, relaxation, and recreation. So they owned it for a long time, and it kind of got a little bit degraded, but they donated it to the county preserve. So we see this bur oak tree, and we know a lot about what the vegetation should look like under a bur oak tree. This tree was born around 1800, and every plant that you can see in here is a non-native plant that wasn't there when this tree was born. If you turn around and take this trail, we can see some of the big oaks. Here's one that's broken off, but all these shrubs are from East Asia and not native. So a lot of restoration work is needed on that. But we also visited Lake in the Hills Fen Nature Preserve, and what a spectacular panorama. You see the rolling landscape of what prairies and a little bit of woodlands was like 200 years ago. You just really feel like you're way back in time. They have a gravel hill prairie. These things are rare in the Chicago wilderness area, and the plants change there. And of course, they have fens, which we'll talk about later. And then we went over to Lake County during the staycation and went to Captain Daniel Wright Woods, where they have done some heroic restoration work of opening up the woods of those Asian shrubs, and it's just a marvel what they've done there. But let's get into it. We've nailed the first topic of our presentation, so let's get into the examples, the great examples of our area. And the first one we're going to talk about is dune and swale habitat, which you might have heard of. Here's an aerial photo over what will become the Gary Airport right here. Klein Avenue will be right here. So a lot of the habitat is still in its pre-settlement condition, basically, and it looks like a lot of parallel lines, kind of like an old-fashioned washboard there. The lighter stripes are low sand ridges, maybe just 5 feet high. The darker lines are wetlands. So the dune and swale habitat, the swale stands for the wetlands, is wetland, dune ridge, wetland, narrower, dune ridge, wider wetland, dune ridge, wider wetland. So this kind of habitat gives spectacular biodiversity, as we'll see. But by the early 1960s, much of it was gone. This part was in the process of being destroyed, but it got saved, as did this, and a few other places. And so here's that parallel dune ridge view here, and then the wetlands that vary in width, and this creates spectacular diversity. Here we have kind of a prairie on the dune ridge, and then we have kind of a savanna, a woodland, all different kinds of wetlands. Here we have a whole bunch of carnivorous plants. I think this is Gibson Woods in Hammond, and this is one of the common carnivorous plants in this particular habitat. How did dune and swale form? Well, we get the idea. Forget the blue right now. Try to mentally take that out. And let's say that we have Lake Michigan on the north at this level, and then the sandy beach would be right here. This is where we'd go throw frisbees and hang out with friends. And then back there'd be the first little dune ridge, and then a wetland, a dune ridge, and a wetland. This went back over 100 ridges in pre-settlement time. But if Lake Michigan dropped for an extended period, 10 or 20 years, so now we'll add in the blue, the water level goes down, And that allows a lot more sand up on the beach, and a new dune ridge forms with a new wetland trapped behind it. And this happened over 100 different times. Some of the wetlands are really wide, like this one. So you get all kinds of zones of vegetation. Here you have mostly oak savanna, excuse me. And then here's a narrow wetland at Seidner Dune and Swale with just a few feet high, the ridge, and so on. Orchids just love this habitat. These kinds of showy lady slipper orchids were in downtown Gary by the thousands. But it's real easy to take a bulldozer and push the sand ridge into the swale and level it all out, and then truck in some topsoil from who knows where. And then you end up with a housing tract or US Steel or whoever on there. And this diversity, again, is over small spatial scales. I took a class once to Shirley Hines, part of Ivanhoe South Preserve. We park here on Colfax Street, took this trail around here. I thought these two dune ridges would have identical plant species diversity, but we made a list of the south one, then went to the north one, and they were 25% different in plant species. And so let's take a look at where most of our dune and swale is here. It formed in this southwest corner of Lake Michigan. This was an embayment over here, shallow embayment of Lake Michigan. The northwest winds piled up much bigger dunes on the Indiana Dunes and over at Warren Dunes. But in this shallow embayment, we just piled up the dune ridges. And you can see some of these spots that are still present. Here's the Ivanhoe Dune and Swale. Here's the Clark and Pine Dune and Swale. Here's a little remnant here at what they call Beemster Bore. Oh no, here's Beemster Bore, DuPont, and Seidner Dune and Swale. There's a little bit over in Illinois. No, that's a golf course there. Here it is, Sand Ridge Nature Preserve. But you can see that we obliterated most of the dune and swale. Now, you oftentimes hear that the dune and swale is a globally rare habitat, and compared to deciduous forest where the leaves fall off the tree, yeah, there's a lot less dune and swale historically than there was dune forest, but there actually was quite a lot. There still is quite a lot of dune and swale in northern parts of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. If we come up to Sleeping Bear Dunes for another part of our field trip here, and we go to Good Harbor Bay, which is a great beach if you ever want to go there, you can see some of the banding pattern here. It's not quite as well developed, but it's very homogeneous, not quite so heterogeneous as ours. Go up to Wilderness State Park near the Mackinac Bridge. And this was an embayment in Lake Michigan, but it's formed into dune and swale. Now notice that most of the dunes are heavily wooded. They don't have open prairie-like components or savanna-like components. That's a big factor as to why our dune and swale is so much more diverse than theirs up north. And then if you take Highway 2, this is where the mother lode of dune and swale is. So you've gone over the Mackinac Bridge. You got a pasty here at Lato's Pasty. If you've never had one of those, be sure to get one sometime. The dune and swale arcing around, and then here it is paralleling the lake, and then they have kind of a rocky shoreline for a while. But then here we have like 1,000 acres of dune and swale in this area, and it just keeps going around here. They're mining something. Here's dune and swale. You can see a little bit of variation in the wetlands. And then finally, you get like what we have, where our dune and swale is right in the town. Here's the town of Manistee. So some people live here, and it's dune and swale across the street. That's like what we have here. So in any event, our dune and swale is highly diverse because of the different sun conditions and the meeting of different vegetation types. Here's that one I mentioned, DuPont, Beemster Bore, and Seidner. This is a spectacular nature preserve. You can, the East Chicago train station is just here to the west a little bit, but you can park right here and walk into all this part. Can't go to DuPont because the river's there, but it's spectacular. The dune and swale, highly varied in all these places. There's the one spot in Illinois. And that Clark and Pine Dune and Swale Nature Preserve in this area, here's a really wide wetland. There's a very rare carnivorous plant there, but Charles C. Deem is the preeminent botanist in the history of Indiana. He was born, I think, in the 1880s and passed away in the 1950s. And just before he passed away in the 1950s, he finally visited Clark and Pine Nature Preserve up here. And he said, I have collected in every township, collected plants in every township in the state of Indiana. I am now in my 80s. This is the finest Indiana natural area I've ever seen in my life. When I quote that, I always get a chill down my spine, but that's up here. There's factories and mills, steel mills all around it. Trucks go pounding right by the nature preserve all the time. And it's the finest natural area in Indiana. Let's move on to and really focus on the oak savanna now, as we roll through these special features of our ecological gem. Now, the oak savannas have kind of an open appearance. A lot of sunlight gets through them. They come in two types: black oak savanna, which is seen here at Miller Woods Savanna in Gary. And it's the black oak savannas are on sand. That's a universal rule, sandy soils. Bur oak savannas are these other four pictures. They're on more of a silty clay soil and not very often on sand. So we'll look a lot at the black oak savannas in a moment, but these bur oaks, here's a lawn in Merrillville, and this bur oak was born in the 1700s, and bur oaks require around 4+ hours of sunlight per day to grow. They can't grow up in a forest. So we know in the 1700s, this was an open savanna kind of habitat. Here's a tree in a bur oak in Illinois that was alone. Some of the low branches are almost hitting the ground. This one is amazing in how fast it grew. But here's one at bur oak savanna in Hobart, Shirley hindsight, no real low limbs. So this one was a little bit more of a grove of trees. But again, it suggests around 1800s, it was oak savanna and Gabus arboretum. Here's one that it looks like around 1800, somebody cut the oak tree down and it sprouted up from what they call the stump. And so this thing is telling us that around 1800, this was an adult oak savanna or a bur oak that somebody cut for wood. Just about the time Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, this thing was in an oak savanna, so we know what we have to do. Now, Illinois has a fair amount of bur oak savanna. Indiana does not have very much right now. On the other hand, they don't have much black oak savanna, and we have a lot of black oak savanna. But we are trying to restore a lot of bur oak savanna. Here's Merrillville, here's I-65, here's Hobart, in that open space, which could have been developed as more housing, but thank heavens, most of it got preserved in nature preserves. It's different entities owning different parcels, but one day it'll all be coordinated and you'll be able to park somewhere and take a day-long hike around here. Won't have to go off to some far away place to do a day-long hike. It'll be in that area. We need volunteers to help with the restoration on this activity. And if 1 out of 1,000 people volunteered, that'd be great. And you may say, buddy, aren't you aiming kind of low there with that? But in Lake County, that'd be 450 people coming out for a work day, and that'd be great. We'd get a lot of work done. Well, I've been mentioning this gradation, and let's really nail it down here. Prairies tend to have no trees or less than 10% tree cover. Savanna has 10 to 50% tree cover, woodland 50 to 80% tree cover, and then forest tends to be 80 to 100% tree cover. So that gradation is common throughout Chicago wilderness of prairie, savanna, woodland, forest. So here's the tall grass prairie in pre-settlement from south central Canada through parts of Minnesota into Illinois, Iowa, northern Missouri, eastern Kansas. It was shorter grass prairie back here. But if we look in the Chicago area, the white are wooded communities, savanna, woodland, and forest. So as you're grading from prairie into forest, you can see all different kinds of gradations in the Chicago wilderness. And this adds to biodiversity because you have this is just a small sample of plants. This isn't even an attempt to come anywhere near all the plants, but some are going to specialize in prairie, some in prairie savanna, some in savanna woodland, some in forest. And so that gradation, which was so common in Chicago wilderness, is adds to plant diversity. And then meanwhile, the birds follow the same pattern, greater diversity of birds and all of the wildlife. So let's look at some beautiful pictures of Miller Woods savanna in Gary. And we can see just the open nature of the wooded community with lots of beautiful flowers in there. This was super high biodiversity. Marquette Park in Gary here, when we're doing a prescribed burn, all of these oak savannas, whether bur oak or black oak, require fire and experienced fire naturally, either by lightning strikes or by Native Americans. And that helped keep these habitats open and diverse. If we go to Prairie Border Northwest, which is over by Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area, we have a tall grass prairie here. You can't see it very well, but there's a wetland there and then grades into a hilly savanna. That gradation all through Chicago wilderness. Here's another picture where you can see the wetland a little bit better. And then Pembroke Savanna in Kankakee County in Illinois is a stunning black oak sand savanna. And here's the biggest challenge right now for savannas and woodlands in Chicago wilderness. About 10 or 12 years ago, there was a huge survival of black oak and sassafras seeds, acorns or seeds. And then when we burn, we end up top killing the small trees, and then they send up multiple sprouts. So the savanna, many of our savannas look like this, spectacular thickets of sassafras, black oak, and other trees. So instead of open like this, and if you come through and burn them, they look open, but each one of these is a black oak shrub right here. So this is going to come up as a big thicket. So in 5 years, this right picture will look just like the left picture. Here's Indiana Dunes National Park where you can see it. So there was a black oak seedling coming up. They had a fire and it top killed the black oak, and then 3 stems came up, 4 stems came up. The older black oaks are not hurt by the fire. They are very fire tolerant, but the young ones get burned and they form a big thicket. Here we can see just a thicket of black oak. Now here's a savanna at Indiana Dunes that looks good. It's on a south facing slope, and hottest part of the day really nails this thing down. And so it didn't have as many black oaks or sassafras or other trees get started, so it didn't stump sprout as much. Another great savanna is Liverpool Nature Preserve. This is just in the little town of Liverpool, just north of Hobart. And these folks have, I hope they know it, they have a world-class nature preserve right across the street. It's just a few dozen acres, but it has spectacular black oak savanna grading into kind of a mesic prairie to a low wet kind of prairie in there. And this small nature preserve is a spectacular gem, and it's in an ocean of European and Asian weeds around it. Derek Nimitz is the DNR biologist who has to take care of this, and he does a heroic job, he and his team. Let's go over to Illinois. Got to get to the Illinois side, Middle Fork Savanna in Lake County. And again, you see the gradation of various kinds of wetlands grading up to prairie into oak woodland, oak savanna. Here he's working in an oak woodland. There's a close-up of the wetland as it grades into prairie, then into various kinds of wooded communities. Rollins Savanna is in Lake County, also stunningly beautiful in a gradation, again, prairie to woodlands. Hickory Creek Barrens in Will County, you can see some of the fire-scarred trees, so there's an opening there, savanna here, oak woodland there. And one of my favorite aerial views is Braidwood Dunes and Savanna Nature Preserve, another one in Will County, Illinois. So we have a prairie here, grading into oak savanna, back to prairie to oak savanna, and then a little more prairie, and then into oak woodland. We have kind of a shrub prairie. I haven't even mentioned that here. This is just incredible diversity of habitats in a small nature preserve, all among 9.5 million people, and there are 400 something of these preserves. And they're beautiful, these savannas, all year. In the autumn, they're stunning. One of my favorite pictures shows the gradation from wet prairie here, Mesic prairie up back there into the wooded communities. This picture taken by Mike McDonald. And he has a book load of pictures of this quality in his book called My Journey into the Wilds of Chicago. And if you have a birthday coming up soon, I would urge you to ask your loved ones to give you this book. Just do a Google search, My Journey into the Wilds of Chicago. He sells it through his webpage, and I think you can get it at bookstores if you still have one near you. And this is, in my opinion, the greatest coffee table book on nature I've ever seen. I don't get any money from him selling these books, but I want everybody to go out and buy it. This will get you through winter. The long, gray, cold winter, this will get you through in excitement about going into Chicago wilderness. The other big problem in our savannas is the non-native honeysuckles or the non-native buckthorn and some other woody ones. So here's Waterfall Glen, a spectacular nature preserve in DuPage County, Illinois. The oak woodland and oak savanna is still present from 200 years ago, but underneath all of these are honeysuckles from Asia, and you can see how they've taken over to the point where they don't allow any other plants to live. They hardly provide any food for animals. Here we have the same thing down here. And so this preserve that surrounds Argonne National Lab, so the preserve is 2,500 acres. There's a 10-mile biking trail around it. So again, you can walk all day practically there, but big chunks of it are filled with Asian honeysuckles. Now they're working like Dickens. One of our graduates working for Stantec is under contract to open up a lot of the woods. And here you can see a place where they've opened up the woods, got it back into a more natural understory, but you can see right in the background, that's the next section of Asian honeysuckles. If nobody does anything about that, they're just going to retake over this area. There are 1,200 non-native plant species in Chicago wilderness, and about 50 of them are real thugs. The other 1,150 we could live with or without. But there are about 50 that have, just by chance, have the right qualities to take over our areas. And the funny thing is, it's all about funding. We just don't have enough funding to take care of some of these efforts. We need volunteers. We need paid people to go in and do it. It's kind of odd in today's world. There are dozens upon dozens of pro baseball players who get paid $1 million to play 10 games. That's the rate at which they get their millions. So a week and a half, they get $1 million to entertain us. If we could have $1 million, we could fix Waterfall Glen, and everybody who goes and visits this preserve will be entertained with the beauty, and they have prairie regions as well. But that's just the way the world is nowadays. Moving on to oak woodlands, about 80% tree cover. That Palos area has huge oak woodlands that are spectacular to walk through and to see all times of the year. And you can see where they sometimes burn some of those sites. Salt Creek Woods, which is part of Cook County Forest Preserves, and it's a special nature preserve for Illinois DNR. They have open prairies there, but it grades into oak woodlands like this, just spectacular. Now we got to move on, keep this show rolling here. We got the tall grass prairie again, kind of making a boomerang shape with shorter grass prairies to the west. And this shows the original extent of the tall grass prairie. This shows where it's left. In Indiana and Illinois, we destroyed 99.9% of the prairie, less in Kansas because this is a very rocky soil. So John Deere's plow didn't work very well on this section. So they kind of just grazed cows on that prairie. So it got kind of degraded because of cow grazing, but which isn't like bison grazing. Bison moved throughout the whole area. We fenced the cows in, so they just go over and over the same area. Here's the first prairie preserve that I know of in Northwest Indiana, German Methodist Prairie Cemetery down near Cedar Lake. It's only about 2 acres. That was it. And then here's Crestmore Prairie by Shirley Hines in Hobart. That's about 40 acres. And then one of the spectacular remnant prairies that somehow got saved in the southwest suburbs is Ginsburg Markham Prairie, a national natural landmark. That's the highest level of nature protection a site can get in the United States. And there it is. And you've all seen it. It's right along the Tri-State Tollway. When you go to O'Hare to pick up a friend, you've just gone through the first I-pass, and shortly after it, you see a big open field to the west or your left as you're going to O'Hare, and that's Ginsberg-Markham Prairie, a national natural landmark. So again, this is that tall grass prairie. This is the northern component. This is the central part that we're a part of, and the southern part, and then mixed grass and short grass prairie. Another great prairie to visit, going over to Illinois, this time in northern Cook County to Northbrook, Illinois, Somme Prairie. And there are actually 3 preserves right next to each other. On the west is Somme Prairie, and that's what we're seeing here. In the middle is Somme Prairie Grove, which is savanna. And on the east is Somme Woods, which is oak woodland. And these are 3 spectacular nature preserves. My friends from college, the Daubers, have lived in Northbrook for decades, and they knew there was nature there, but they didn't know how spectacular they were till we went and visited them. And they have great volunteers there that are doing great work. And if you want to learn about the effort that's taken, just do a Google Vestal Grove blogspot, and you'll be able to hear what they've done over the decades, how they did it with volunteers. The 2 times I've been to the preserves, I've seen volunteers both times working there. Wolf Road Prairie in the western suburbs is spectacular, and it almost got developed, but the Great Depression stopped that. So here we have a great view of 2 different seasons. It grades into an oak savanna, and prairies, of course, need fire. This is the various head fires, and it goes into the savanna. There's 31st Street. You can see the smoke is lifting, so it's a prescribed fire. They know how to burn it to minimize smoke to the neighborhoods there. And then let's speed up. We'll see they've done a backfire here to keep the fire contained. Then they do the head fire. They're burning toward the unit we saw them do a little bit earlier. And so now they know that this whole zone here is burned out, so they can let this be just like 1700 on the prairie when it burned. That one certainly is informative prairie fire burn. West Chicago Prairie out in the far western suburbs. Here's a map showing all the different soil types, both of the exact soil texture, the moisture. You can see there are 24 different soil types. So not surprising, West Chicago Prairie is a spectacularly diverse site. And of course, we have to, because of the 9.5 million people, we have to plan how to get these prairies functioning bigger. So like, for example, Hoosier Prairie in Griffith is right here, Oak Ridge Prairie here, and a few other sites the DNR has found that were remnant prairies, and a few sites that could be restored. So maybe we can get a little bit of an amalgamation of a prairie. We have a lot of storage tanks here, oil storage tanks and all that stuff in there, but we give all of this around it to humans. And then if we just plan right, we can get a kind of a mega preserve going. Let's get into forest here. And of course, this time you're going to have 100% tree cover unless there's been recent storm damage. So here you can see it's about 100%, but here's a preserve in Southwest Michigan that in 2020 or 2021 had a major blowdown of trees in it. So the forest will have to regenerate there, but you've got it already. There's that Asian honeysuckle problem in the forest as well as in the oak savanna and woodland. And anytime we talk about forests, we have to try to figure out what was the pre-settlement forest like. And we don't have pictures from back then. We don't have obvious help in that way, except when they walked the lines to mark townships out. The surveyors in the early 1800s in our area walked endlessly, carried heavy chains to measure the distance. And when they got to half half section marks and corner section marks. They would find a tree nearby and they would mark it and write down what kind of tree. They would measure its diameter and so on, and what the compass direction, how far away from the point it was. That tells us a lot about the forest. If they had to walk 80 feet to find a tree to mark, then we know the forest was open, was more of a savanna or open woodland. If they only had to go 5 feet and they got a 3-foot diameter tree, well, then we know it's more of a forest. And what this shows is about 200 histograms or bar charts, but they're rotated 90 degrees so that the bars go to the right. And in this particular case, the darker the marks, that means the more beech and sugar maple. These are trees that like a moist soil, not too dry, and they don't like fire. So we can see the central third of Indiana had a lot of beech maple that didn't burn all that often. There were sections in southern Indiana and parts of the hilly terrain up here that had it. But then if you do it for oaks, you can see the oaks were common around the Prairie Peninsula here. A lot of oaks in the northern part and in the southern part, and a few oaks in the central part. And if you combine them, you can see where the forest was most extensive in Indiana in pre-settlement times. And they've done this not just for Indiana, but all the states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And so here the white is prairie, the tan is savanna, then the light green is woodland, the dark green is forest. And there's that gradation, and it's all throughout Chicago wilderness. This is the density of trees. So we can see there were a lot of trees in that central part of Indiana. The basal area measures how big the trees were. So the darkest green area in all of the Western Great Lakes was central Indiana. So combined biomass, the biggest, most majestic forests in the Western Great Lakes were in central Indiana. Now, you've probably heard about the giant white pine or hemlock of northern Michigan. Yeah, they were there, but they were kind of scattered in the woods. Only occasionally were they dense. The biggest, most majestic forests at the time of settlement were in central Indiana. So looking at a couple samples of forest before we get to aquatic sites and wrap things up here, we have Ambler Flatwoods, which is up by Michigan City. It's a flatwoods, as its name suggests, so slight undulations, and you get ponding in there. And these wetlands are spectacular in Ambler Flatwoods. Here are 3 of them, and you can see the vegetation is different in every one. And so you go through the mosaic of wetlands and forest. The forest varies a lot. Most of the new trees come in when old trees fall down. So in some places you'll get red oaks and white oaks. They got just enough sun to get going. Beech trees can survive in the shade for decades. And this one is probably 250 years old here. So we know 250 years ago in 1776 about, it was an open, or it was a closed shady forest in most places, but occasionally here's a 100-year-old black cherry tree, which can't survive in this much shade for very long. But we know that 80 to 100 years ago, this was an opening in the woods. Here's how these openings occur. And in Ambler, because of the wet soils, the roots of the trees can't go very deep into the soil. Here only about 8 or 10 inches. So they do easily blow over. So here's a recent blow over, and looks like we might have an ash tree here. Young ash are not susceptible to the emerald ash borer, which is an accidental introduction from East Asia. Once it gets older, it could succumb to the emerald ash borer. Here's one from about 5 years ago. So the soil has started to wash out of the tip-up mound. And what do we have here? It looks like this was a white oak tree, and a hickory looks like it's taking its place. So the forest is a spectacular slow motion movie. You got to go through, look at all the trees that blow down, look at what kind of tree it was and who's winning in the gap. Here's one that's 8 years old. Most of the soil has fallen off. And here's that first one we saw a bunch of slides ago. This one blew down about 12 years ago. So in 12 years, the tree has rotted and the soil's come down to form a mound and a pit. So the pit is where the roots got ripped up. The mound forms when the soil dropped down. on this. So if you're in a woodland with lots of pit and mound topography, that tells you it's probably a highly natural woodland that wasn't heavily logged. Because if we came through, say, in 1880 and cut down a bunch of trees, they didn't get old enough to be blown over and uprooted. They got cut down. So if you see a woodland with a lot of pit and mound topography, then you know it's probably a less disturbed one. If you're in New England, they call it cradle and pillow. So this is the cradle and that's the pillow. And these this kind of topography lasts about 100 years before it levels out. So here we have one that's getting kind of level. The pit is just barely above the mound. And here's about a 100-year-old black cherry tree, maybe 120 years. So we know in the early 1900s, a tree got blown down at Ambler off to the right here. That created a little bit of sunlight coming down. A black cherry seed got moved by a bird that ate the cherries and defecated the seed there by chance. And it had just enough light to get going. That's that slow motion movie I'm talking about. Bloom County Park, we can kind of see, this is a very old mound here. The pit, it's almost leveled out. Here's another one. There's the pit, there's the mound, and here's a second tree that fell down. So this one grew on the mound and then it fell down. So there was a big tree that was uprooted 100 years ago that went off to the right. This tree got started and now it's been uprooted. It looks like it rotted out its roots, but we can learn a lot about it. Creek Ridge County Park in LaPorte County, same kind of dynamic. And again, with Ambler and other areas, if we just work together with various agencies, we can give lots of housing tracts to people, but we could also save our ecological gem. Some woods in Illinois and in Will County, Messenger Woods, spectacular spring flower show near Valparaiso Marine Nature Preserve, 300-year-old beech trees in this site, some ancient red oaks that are, red oaks can grow at a lot of different rates you can see, but these are ancient red oaks that tell us what the forest was like. Marine Nature Preserve is kind of a odd shape, but it has over 1,000 acres now, and there we can see Marine Nature Preserve, but then we have Porter County Parks here, Sunset Hill Farm County Park, Shirley Hines's property. I think they've added this parcel up here, so that will become dark green. We can manage all those woods. Hickory Creek has some forest in it and grading into a woodland and then grading into prairie, tall grass prairie. Now here's an interesting one in Will County where we looks like it's a forest because we have sugar maples in autumn here. But actually all the adult trees are oaks, and this particular tree had two very large lower branches on it. How come it had lower branches in the shade of a forest? Well, it probably was a much more open forest by fire 150 years ago. And then also a farmer allowed cows to graze in this area, and he kept this tree here as a shade tree. So that's how come these nubs came out. These nubs are telling us this probably was where cows took refuge from the sun on a hot day. So this site was degraded by cow grazing. And this is just further down the trail just a little bit. And we can see that because of many decades of fire suppression, the maples are coming from the forest, which might be a half a mile away, and they're coming into the oak woodland, converting it to a forest. Ritchie Nature Preserve, same kind of thing. This is practically in the town of Chesterton. Some ancient red oaks in here. Now we have a tulip tree that looks ancient, but they grow really fast. So we know 100 years ago, around 1920, there's a big pillar of sun that came down in that spot. And here's how red oaks can grow so many different rates. Here's a tree that's 25 years old. It's barely greater in diameter than a rake handle. Here's one that was transplanted in 2008. It's only 13 years old and it's much wider. So when we study forests and woodlands, we're trying to figure out how it is that oaks naturally regenerate, because in a nutshell, Doug Tallamy will give you the details on that. But oaks need a whole bunch of factors to regenerate to get sunlight: fire, drought, native insect outbreaks, storms, and so on. And we don't oftentimes allow those anymore after human settlement. So many of our oaks, which are orange here, are declining, especially in our forests. So when we go to many nature preserves that don't get fire, don't get storms so much, or don't get native insect outbreaks. The oaks are there, but they're fading out in some of these forests, and beech trees are taking over. Here's one that might have started by fire in the late 1800s, another one by 1800s, and of course that blowdown. But we got to quickly do the wetland sites very quickly. A fen, well, here's a whole bunch of words telling us what a fen is, but let's look at a picture. A fen forms usually in some kind of depression. Now, the glaciers made these depressions, but oftentimes they become lakes, and the water levels over here, and the jet skis are zooming around up on the water. But in this case, the basin doesn't form a lake. It has an outflow to it, but it has groundwater rich in calcium and magnesium. And as that groundwater comes up, this calcium and magnesium makes a high pH wet soil. Not most soils are a little bit acidic, but in this case, it's kind of a basic high pH soil. And a lot of this calcium and magnesium compounds precipitate out as a white chalky marl. So the plants that can live in this kind of wet marl are very specialized. And so they start growing up and adding organic matter to the fen. So this is a wetland that grows up because water is pushing up into and forming a wet soil. But depending on how the water works its way up, you might get a regular old prairie in some parts. You might get calcium-loving plants in another, all grasses in another. So the dome of a fen is going to be highly variable. And where the water leaks out to the side, it oftentimes just forms a regular marsh and then a stream, and there's multiple domes in there. So here's Springfield Fen near Michigan City, and this is a graminoid or grass-dominated area. These are the same views a couple months apart in here, and different kinds of flowers blooming as we go. And here's a good view of a fen in Michigan. So we have a dome here grading down to a stream, and so it's graminoid. It's a shrub fen there, all different kinds of habitats. The glaciers left a pile of gravel right there, so we have an oak island in the middle of it, as you've heard 1,000 times. Spectacular diversity, calcium-loving plants, another oak dome in a highly variable fen habitat. These fens are so delicate. Here's a prairie in a fen habitat. Sometimes, though, the fens do burn, and so we burn, and here we can see various zones of habitat. I believe the last stop on our nature tours here is going to be another type of wetland. There's a dozen types of wetlands. We can't do them all, but coastal plain marshes. And they're very common in select places in Northwest Indiana and Southwest Michigan. They are found in these areas and a few other places, but they're similar to coastal plain marshes along the southeast and east coast of the US. So what makes a coastal plain marsh? It's almost always on sand, and usually, of course, there's a big depression there. But the thing about sites that become coastal plain marshes, whether it's the Carolinas or up here in Northwest Indiana, is that the water level fluctuates much more wildly than other kinds of wetlands do. So it might start out here, it could flood during a year, it could drop down real fast. Some years it starts out with hardly any water. Some years it looks like a lake. But the water level goes up and down erratically over months and years, much more than a natural wetland. And occasionally during dry times, they catch fire. And there can be organic matter, black organic matter build up over the sand. So here's a coastal plain marsh in South Carolina. We can see that zonation. A flood time, it's up here, it's like a lake. Then there's a grass zone, a brush zone, and some floating vegetation. Here's one from Southwest Michigan, again, showing kind of a prairie up here to a wet prairie, all different zones. You can just see the different kinds of vegetations. They're very erratic in their water holding. And Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area has a whole bunch of these about an hour southeast of our campus. Notice they burned this unit in this year and probably burned that one too. You can see they're darker from the ash of the burn. Ross Coastal Plain Marsh, about 20 miles into Michigan. They had a non-native plant problem, but they took care of that. But we can see that kind of sandy soil and how much the water can go down over a season. Now here's standing at the same place one year that was the first of a dry year. So a lot of the open areas didn't grow plants, but then the next year was dry as well. And you got a whole zone of plants. And another year could be wet and be almost like a knee-deep lake the whole year. So the vegetation is very dynamic in coastal plain. We can see again, has it vegetated because it's entering a dry area. A year later, 2 years later, fully vegetated, ferns giving rise to grasses, all different kinds of shrubs and meadow beauty that are indicators of coastal plain marshes. And here's to show that erratic. These two wetlands were taken pictures on the same day. So here's a coastal plain marsh in April and not a drop of water. Here's one at Moraine Nature Preserve, and it didn't quite fill up. There's the high water mark in winter time, but it still was mostly full. But this one never didn't get anywhere near full. A year later, here's where it started, half full. And this one probably looked just like that. So coastal plain marshes are highly variable in their hydrology and create spectacular diversity of plants. Well, I've gone through just a smattering of the special features of our habitats. We could have a whole nother webinar to show you habitats in Chicago wilderness. But I've emphasized that we have to do a lot of restoration work in order to keep the gold medal around our neck. And that can be with students here pre-COVID, everybody's close together, all buddy, happy as can be. This particular day, it was about 38 degrees with rain falling sideways into your ears like needles. And I think they're having a good time in there, but students get out and do it, help with our campus nature preserve. But as I mentioned, there are 400 nature preserves, so nothing special. We get to burn these preserves. All of them need fire. They naturally had fire during pre-settlement conditions. And we have to maintain with fire these situations. Now here's one from our campus burn. Here's that slender parking lot. Here's the west part of our big parking lot. And so let's just take a look at what this was like in April. In this case, it was a south wind coming from the campus. So we first burned out areas up here, or it was green and wouldn't catch fire. And that way we can just burn in. Here's another one. This is the sidewalk along Broadway. So there's our large parking lot. The wind is blowing from Broadway most of the time in this particular one. So we burned the levee slope over there. So that fire is coming, the two fires are coming together. So they're all go out because they're impossible over traffic. And of course, we have young people excited about doing restoration as a career. This is a real career opportunity. Jessica Gomez got a lot of experience in restoration up here, but now she works down at Kankakee Sands, where you may have heard they have the bison roaming free on 1,000 acres of prairie. She does heroic work there. Joelle Perez here hand wicking one of the worst weeds we have, called Phragmites, in a dune and swale habitat that he's restored. This picture on the right looks like it could be northern Michigan, but it's right among steel mills and everything right here. Joelle's team is doing great work on this. And I just show a few pictures here of our campus preserve, but again, there are 400 of these things. And so in various places, in wet areas, we have lots of these pink flowers. We have one species of carnivorous plants, and of course, lots of pollinators love the flowers. Tall grass prairie, pictures along Broadway. Animals benefit, of course, the monarch butterfly, but even something like this white false indigo that makes these seed pods, and the seeds inside get eaten by weevils, and then birds crack the pods open and eat the weevils. So it's all interconnected, and we can be there. The sandhill cranes occasionally come and breed by the campus. Their numbers have been going up in northern Indiana as far as breeding. There's the young one back there. There's the two adults right next to the parking lot. And as Doug Tallamy tells us in his webinars, that again, I urge you all to watch some of his webinars, the one on oaks, the one on bringing nature's best hope, that we can do this at our homes. And we don't have to, we can have a national park at our homes as far as putting in these native plant communities. I gave this presentation a while back in Riverside, Illinois, and they have a community group that gets out and restores. They took out a dam, so now the river flows much more naturally, and they needed to revegetate the banks from non-native vegetation. They get out and do it. So with one more video to come as we get ready for questions, again, this activity of getting out and restoring our gold medal can be done by people of all ages, all backgrounds. They work together as a team, and we can do it in either restoration or just going out to enjoying it. And one last fire picture here from Luff Spring Fen in Elgin. So here's where this was a dry year, so they decided to burn it in a dry year. And you can see different zones of vegetation in the domes. Here's another one of those gravel hills. So there's a hill prairie back there with an oak savanna here grading into a fen. Where else does this happen? And it's just a miracle that these places got saved. And so here they are using this trail as a border. They burned out areas down here into the woodland, so they know their fire will go around, and ultimately they can burn most of the fen in this somewhat dry year, which is when fens typically burned in drier years. So I thank everybody for coming out and sticking with us, and urge everybody to get out and enjoy Chicago wilderness anywhere. And I'll be glad to answer any questions or anything else that people have.
So it looks like there's one question on here about Gary's golf course. They're curious if it's still there and if IU plans to adopt it.
Well, I'm not a part of any of the discussions on the Gleason Park golf course that just kind of went under a few years back. And, you know, I've heard at one point people talked about building a new high school there. I heard, you know, getting businesses there, homes there. I don't know what the latest thought is, but it appears to be that the city wants to do something in terms of developing it. Of course, it could be restored into a natural area. The northern part of it floods more often than the southern part, so it could be a wetland grading into a little bit more. But because it's so dominated by European plants, it would take a huge amount of effort and funding to restore it, and I just don't know if that's available. I sure wish it could happen. Now, a few plants from our campus nature preserve have spread their seeds. You can walk along the edge of the golf course and you can see some plants in there that I know were not there. Their seeds have moved in from the campus, but whether that's going to happen at a big scale or not, I don't know.
Dr. Courtwright, a participant would like to know your thoughts on the wildfires in Canada.
Okay, well, you know, a lot of those forests up there in Canada do have a natural fire regime. So they do catch fire naturally. You know, they're so far away from moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. So when they have lightning storms, sometimes there isn't a lot of rain. So they would catch fire naturally. But what I'd like to know, and I need to see more information on, is how dry have the recent years been in Canada? How dry, how much snow was there this winter? What have the temperatures been like in recent years? Once I see data that tells me if the weather has been abnormally dry and warm, then I might think that the wide extent of the fires in Canada is possibly more extreme than historical because of an altered climate. But until I see the numbers, I'm not going to go promoting that viewpoint. I do think that the fires seem, from the maps that I've seen, more extensive than they would naturally, but I got to get more information before I start automatically saying it's a climate change issue. But fire is natural in those woods. And then also the thing that is also a conflicting factor is that we've had some weird weather systems that have been in this warm months here, been pushing wind day after day after day from the north. So there could have been fires in other years, but we had south winds coming up through our area, so we didn't even notice the smoke. You know, but for some reason, we've had weather where day in and day out, north wind, and so that's what made us notice the smoke so much more than in other fire years.
Okay, Dr. Courtwright, I'd like to thank you for being with us this evening.
It was my pleasure.